I'm most interested in kind of going back 2.5, 3 years when the museum went out requesting proposals. What in that proposal and what in Davenport made you apply and take on such a project?
Well, I think when we applied, we didn't know that much about Davenport, so I'm not sure it was necessarily any particular aspects about Davenport itself, which I'm now more familiar with. But I think it was, I mean, I'm always attracted to any public project. I mean, I think as an architect, you know, all buildings are interesting, but projects which involve, civic or public aspirations are always much more fascinating. And from what I understood of the project, that this was not just the idea of doing a building, but that it was linked in with the city's ambitions to use the building to stimulate downtown regeneration. And I found that, always do find that rather appealing. So I suppose that was the major thought. I mean, plus, I mean, I love museum projects. I mean, I think museum projects are, but again, partly because of their public program.
Your initial trips, and you've been here several times, and your design has changed somewhat because the site has changed. What elements of the downtown, after you've gotten to know us, how did you react to that, and can you explain then that reaction in your design?
I think the thing that I found most difficult at the beginning was how to deal with the fragmented nature of the existing downtown area. In a European context, the way that the downtown structure has been eroded is quite shocking, I would say. I mean, we're used to everything being built and there aren't that many gaps. And so it's quite difficult to know how to deal with this sort of inconsistent pattern of buildings and gaps and car parkings and little bits of park. And I suppose I was quite disorientated at first with, the openness of the site. I mean, having said that, and therefore not quite knowing how to deal with the urban structure, the natural structure and the natural elements clearly were something to respond to. I mean, of course, the river, the flatness of the site, and the dimension, it's a sort of wonderful horizontal dimension you get from the site. I mean, that's something that survives all sorts of downtown, development. So I think what's interesting about the project is how it deals with, on the one, how we have to deal with, on the one hand, a sort of downtown urban fabric, and on the other hand, the natural, what I would call the, natural and physical qualities of the site, being the river. I think when I first started, I was more concerned with trying to, and I think it was partly to do with the fact of the first site being a little bit more located with, First Street. I suppose I saw it more of an urban building at the beginning. I think the project's developed now so that I think it is a downtown building. I think it's an urban volume, but at the same time, I think it's probably a little bit more relaxed about the sort of more open nature of the site and the sort of three-dimensionality of the site, which is not very common in a European context. We tend to have, downtowns are normally much more parceled up, and you don't get this opportunity of a more solitaire building. So I think that's that's been a big change in the way that the building has developed and, conceptually, from trying to sort of patch up the fabric, which the first project did, because it was really located in a smaller part of the site. Now, in a way, the new site for the building means that it has to deal with the whole block, both to the north and to the south. And I think in that sense I was a little bit nervous about that move, because it has to do more work, if you like. I mean, it's got more to relate to. It's got to relate to the river, it's got to relate to River Drive, it's got to relate to the downtown, it's got to relate to Harrison, it's got to, it's much more. It's a building that now you're going to be able to see from 4 sides, and it's got to deal with those 4 sides. So I think that's I think in other terms, I think it stayed rather similar to very early concepts of trying to enjoy its sight. And the idea that if you went up a bit, then you were going to find yourself with these phenomenal views over the landscape and over the river. I mean, that's been a sort of consistent element of all the design schemes.
As a native Davenporter, can you help me? It's a very modern building. Can you maybe tell me the elements that are maybe new that you've introduced, and what would I find yet here in Davenport, elements that are similar in other architecture?
Ooh. I think if you look at the old drawings and paintings and photographs of the city, what's appealing was this sort of front row of industrial buildings that created the relationship between the city and the river. And if one was to lament anything, I think, in terms of what this is, I would say that front row relationship and the very genesis of the city, that bond between the city and the river, nearly like a wall. If you look at the old drawings, that was a sort of very, and a typical industrial relationship. I mean, all cities had it, and to some degree we've all lost it, because that very primary, pragmatic genesis of cities is no longer so essential, especially in river and port conditions. But it always tended to produce this sort of fantastically assured architecture, sort of nearly confident industrial architecture. It wasn't fancy, it was just solid and in some ways banal. I mean, there was something very nice about industrial architecture, because it's not pretentious. It's just there to do things. And I always like that type of warehouse industrial architecture, mills, and I think that there's I would like to think there's a spirit of that in this building, and that it's a very singular form. I didn't want a sort of fussy building, and I didn't want a sort of pompous civic building with steps and columns, and I think it's very important that the Contemporary Museum is a threshold that you can step over very easily. That it, that barrier between inside and outside should be eroded. The classic museum was somehow an elevated shrine or temple that that protected and preserved and embodied, civic, culture within a civic context. And I think this is, a community centre in a way. So I like the idea that it's a very, singular object, and it's got a certain simplicity to it that I would associate with, riverside buildings, sort of warehouse-like buildings. and at the same time that straightforwardness encapsulates some of its sort of social directness in terms of it not trying to put up barriers to the outside. I think that is also why we've used glass to sort of try and suggest a sort of openness and a transparency and a lightness, even though the form is quite a solid form, because it's not a glass building, it's a solid building with enormous protective walls, because that's what museums have to have. I mean, you have to hang art on walls and you have to stop light getting into the building in lots of ways, so they tend to be rather solid objects. But this is clad in glass to give this sense of transparency and openness.
The building, as you say, is singular, and the feedback that I've gotten is that it's so different. How do you see it influencing what we're about to build in other parts of the River Renaissance project, and maybe in particular the skywalk that also will kind of stand on its own in a half a block away? What kind of influence do you think this building should have on that, or vice versa?
Ooh, I'm not sure. I think it will. The first part of the question. I mean, there's no doubt it's going to change the sense of the city and the sense the city has of itself. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt about that. It will, and obviously, I want people to like it. I'm not an architect that feels that one's got some sort of right to sort of dump egotistical, notions onto unsuspecting communities. I have this sort of rather privileged situation that I work in many countries and many places, except my own, strangely, and that's very much sort of made me always consider, what this building should be, what any particular building should be within its context. I mean, if one looks at the body of my work, I mean, I hope there's a consistency, but actually every building is quite different. I mean, this building is something which has grown out of working here. It's not something I would have built in another place. I mean, not even necessarily the materials. I mean, it's all somehow, I hope, reflecting. It's a reaction to the situation. And I think, for instance, the idea of the glass has always been there in this concept of something very mineral, next to the river. I don't think that in terms of, I'm not so obsessed with architectural style. I mean, I'm hoping that it becomes a sort of natural and indisputable element of the city. In my architecture, I sort of don't, I'm not looking for something which, in a way, announces itself as being one thing or another. It seems to me that you're looking for something which takes on nearly natural qualities. I mean, I think civic architecture used to have to be very representative of something. Had to have columns to represent. The bank had to look one way to represent security, and town hall has to. And we don't have that architectural language requirement, and we can't sum up those things. So I think that I'd like to believe that it has a modernity, but it's not modern just to try and be modern. It's just modern, it's because of the way it's put together and the materiality. I want it to be a very physical building. I want the experience of walking through it, getting up to the roof and getting these wonderful views to be a very physical experience. I want the feeling on a sunny morning that the light shadows through this wall would be just, you'll stop and just think that's beautiful. It's not because necessarily saying I like the building, I mean, and maybe this is, I'm not explaining it very well, but it's made up of a series of ideas that I hope, and I'm fairly confident, will become popular. I want it to be, because I think the biggest question when you're doing a building in a community is to somehow give a community a building which they're going to like and grow fond of. I'm sort of very concerned about that. But on the other hand, I don't think you do that by necessarily at the beginning saying, well, I'm going to give something that everyone is fond of because they know what it is. But I don't think you can. I don't think you necessarily deny fondness by giving something which is new. I think you can make people fond of a building by the fact that it's got certain physical attributes and qualities, whether that is to do with the way you enter and experience it, or whether it's to do with, as you drive past it, how it's going to be, what it's going to do. At night it's going to shine in a certain way, and you're going to see it from across the river, and it's going to look beautiful in that way. So I'm not answering your question very precisely, but I think it will be, in terms of its shape and its form, it will be completely alien to people's expectations. But I'm pretty confident that it will finally become, more Davenport than anything else. To what degree it could influence or inspire or other things around it, I'm not sure. I mean, I hope that it will certainly have an enormous influence in terms of the way that downtown will start working. And I think some of that will just be an organic change. I expect things to happen. I expect little shops and restaurants to open, as they always do when there's all of a sudden there's a sort of social change like that. Whether it will have an aesthetic influence, and people start saying, well, how do we respond to that? Because we've got a very different thing to look at. I think it will. I mean, I think it will put people on their edge, as all things do. I mean, as soon as something is taken seriously, and I think, the community is taking this thing very seriously now. I mean, there's been a lot of people working on this project for a long time, and I think that in itself is an incredible achievement, for a community to say, we want to build a new building, we want to build a building of the highest quality, and we're going to take this thing really seriously. I think that's already up the ante. I think that's already said, from now on, every time we're going to do something, it's got to match up to the intensity that's been put into this. Whether it's made out of brick, or whether it's in a vernacular, or whether it's I don't care. I think, I'm very Catholic about these things. I think that, I don't think the world should all look the same. But I do think that things should be taken seriously. Our physical environment should be very seriously. So when someone, designs benches for the street, that's got to be taken very seriously. I don't care what style it's in, really. I do, but I'm not, I don't want, I wouldn't want to see a sort of, some sort of sanction on only being one way. I think all I would ask is that, and I would expect that from now on, when things are done, I'm sure that the museum will have an influence in terms of promoting and provoking, the quality by which things should be done, because I think that that's what the community is doing by this building, is to sort of say, this is really important, and the way we do it is really important. And whether people like it or not, what's going to be undeniable, I think, is that a relatively small community will have put together in an exemplary manner a very, very serious project of the highest quality.
It is a civic building, and this is my final question. You have the opportunity to create a public square with the changing of the location here on 2nd Street. And at this point, can you tell me what your hopes are for that public square in terms of people's interaction with it, what are you going to put into that design to make that a place that is happening for Davenport?
It's difficult to completely anticipate social behavior. I mean, one of the things that architects and planners have got wrong throughout contemporary times is trying to be too precise about the way that people behave, because Sod's law tells you that if you think they're going to do one thing, they'll do something else. However, one thing that has been borne out, that if you have a building which is an important building and takes an important role within the community, then the spaces around that, and certainly the spaces in front of it, are fairly safely guaranteed a certain level of activity if the climate's on those days that one can do it. I think that the thing that fascinates me, and is fascinating me to an increasing degree about this project, is that in Europe, a museum tends to be it still tends to be a sort of collection-based idea, and it's still rather, a shrine to the objects that it holds. I think what's fascinating in the Midwest is the notion that these museums or art centers are very much art centers and have a very strong community component. It'd be very unusual in Europe to have so much education space, so much of a building given over to education space. I mean, I can't even think of an arts building that would have that. I mean, here we've got enormous studios, we've got auditoriums, we've got education center. I mean, it's really an enormous part of the building. So I see this as a community building, and therefore the public space that goes along with it, I think is given even more opportunity to be community space. I think it's another opportunity for the museum. It's another exhibition space for the museum. This is going to be, again, subject to their ability to finance and to find sponsors to do this, but I think the idea of putting sculptures out there, to put events in the summer, to do all those things, I mean, it's really a stage, and I think we've designed it as a sort of stage in front of the building, and it's a public stage which is there both for the museum and the community, and I'm pretty confident that it's being set up to help those activities happen. I mean, one can't guarantee it, but I can't see that it precludes it happening. And I think if downtown wants a meeting place and a social space, I think this is really, articulated in such a way that I think it's got a very good chance of succeeding.
I'd like you to take me around the model and kind of explain the building, how it works, how it functions, what it's made of.
Well, this is the northern side, the approach side to the building off of 2nd Street. There will be a large civic space here, slightly stepping up towards the entrance. Really, the building splits into very simple blocks within this silhouette. Around the entrance and on this part of the building, going through to the river with great views over the river, is the public areas. The entrance, bookshop, the lobby, the restaurant. We have all the back of house areas on the ground floor here, with the main loading here. This is the education wing on this floor, which contains studios, a sort of educational center, auditorium, research center, and administration. The permanent galleries are over here on the first level, and then you move up through the building to the temporary galleries, which are on these 2 levels. If we go, so This is the main entrance. You'll come through. This is conceived, I mean, the piazza comes up, and we're trying to make the lobby of the building an extension of that public space. The building is visible on all sides. I mean, it's a solitaire which has really got to face Second. It's got to face River Drive and the river, and it's got to face the other side. So it's got two fronts in a way. It's got a front to the downtown. It's got a front to the river, and we've designed it in such a way that you can approach the building from both sides. Clearly, the most practical approach is this side, but really the idea is that you can approach it from both sides and you can walk through the building. So we're trying to see the lobby as very much a public space.
So you can actually see how you would go out the other side as you come in.
Yes, I mean, if we go around the other side, this is the River Drive frontage. You can see through the building, you can see how you could have come in from Second through the piazza and actually walking towards the river, with a view over the river. And having been through the museum, you can easily walk down the stairs and go down to the river. Here you can see the educational wing, and here are the stairs that are going up to the temporary gallery. As you go up through the building, because when you're going, one of the issues about seeing art is you've got to look at paintings. It's very difficult to mix big windows and paintings together. However, we've got a spectacular view from here. So having been through the permanent collection, which is a rather isolated and it's very internally looking series of spaces, you change for a minute into this enormous window. And this window is the way up, the terraces that take you up to the temporary collection. So at that point, you'll turn around and look at this spectacular view. So that's the point when you get, as well as the lobby area, when you get this wonderful awareness of the building's location in the landscape. The building is clad with a glass with a sort of very fine fritted lines which create shading over the window areas, and that glass clads not only the window areas but also the rest of the building. So it's a sort of, although it presents itself as a glass building, it's a solid building with holes in it and then covered with one uniform material to give it a sort of monolithic and singular quality, and that it will sort of glisten. And at night, of course, it will sort of radiate this sort of warm light.